Hey, Clayton. In Numbers 31, after the battle with the Midianites, why did Israel have to kill all the men, women, and boys, but could keep the virgins for themselves? Let me summarize the story here. Israel has just won a battle against a group of people, the Midianites, and they're taking the spoils after the battle. So they're going through the things that are left behind and taking those things. And Moses sees that in the midst of this, they have spared some of the people. They've killed soldiers, but there are other people around that are survivors. And he objects to this. And so he says to them in Numbers 31, verse 17 and 18, he says, "Now kill all the boys and kill every woman who has slept with a man, but save for yourselves every girl who has never slept with a man." Now, there are a number of disturbing things in this. It's a sentence that sounds, in many respects, like the sort of thing you'd read in the news, some horrific tragedy on the other side of the world where some, group of warlords has come to a town and they've, wiped everybody out and, taken the virgins for themselves. And it's really horrific and awful. And it sounds, at first reading, a little bit like that. And there's a couple of reasons. One of the reasons is that Moses basically says to kill everybody, right? And this is a question that comes up in a few different places in the Bible. We will probably end up digging into this more over the course of the next year when we read the book of Joshua in the fall, because the conquest of Canaan talks a lot about wiping out towns and this sort of thing. So we'll dig into that. We don't have time to get into all of the questions about violence and war in the Bible right here and right now. But that's one of the things that seems really hard. Like, why kill all of these people? Not just the soldiers, but the boys and the women who didn't fight. And then the further thing is, why keep the virgins, right? That feels very much like treating women as property, and they're the spoils of war, and just kind of sexual appetites that just seem really awful and very exploitative. So what do we do with this? Now, I want to point you to the interview that we did with Carmen Imes about women in the Pentateuch. She answered not a question about this particular passage, but a similar passage in Deuteronomy where it talks about in a battle, if there is a woman who's a survivor and you take her to be your wife, what do you do? And there's all sorts of questions around that. We'll put a link to that video in the description if you want to check it out. I'll say this, I cannot make this passage easy, okay? And there are times when we're just going to be left uncomfortable with some things in the Bible, but I do think I can give some context that will at least make it seem less completely crazy, okay? Completely objectionable. One thing that helps to remember is that this, even though it's in chapter 31 of Numbers, is actually the aftermath of something that happens in chapter 25 in Numbers. And there's a whole section of like laws and instructions that come in between that makes it so that you kind of forget the context because it's been a few days since you read it. But if you realize this is actually the aftermath of a different event, it does actually change how it feels, okay? In Numbers 25, this is the story where the Moabites and the Midianites, these two groups of people that are there, they're trying to stop Israel because Israel's coming through their land and they're nervous about Israel. Israel's won some battles against some other people and they know that God is with them and they're thinking, we want to stop them. They went so far as to hire a prophet named Balaam to curse them. We actually talked about this in an episode of the Bible Savvy podcast, but Balaam wasn't able to curse them. God protected them. And so instead of cursing them, they decided, here's what we're going to do. And this is actually Balaam's idea. We're going to try and seduce them away from God. And the way we're going to do it is we're going to tempt them both with idolatry, but also sexual immorality. And those two things often went together in the ancient world. They were sometimes the forms of idolatrous worship involved sexual activity as a form of worship. And so they, the Midianites actually went to the people of Israel, the men of Israel, and said, hey, could come sleep with us, and kind of seduce them into following their gods and sleeping with them. And so this is what Moses specifically calls out. So right before the passage I read to you where he says, yeah, kill the women and the boys and keep the virgins for yourself. In verse 15, he says this, and this is important context. Have you allowed all the women to live? He asked them. They were the ones who followed Balaam's advice and enticed the Israelites to be unfaithful to the Lord in the Peor incident so that a plague struck the Lord's people. Because the people abandoned God and God disciplined them for that. And so Moses is saying, wait. This group of people, these are the people who deliberately strategized how to seduce you away from the Lord and into sin, and you're just letting them live? Like, you're just going to sort of keep them around? Like, they're going to like travel with you now? Like, what are you going to do with this? These are the people who got you in trouble in the first place. They're your enemies, and they're seducing you away from God, which means this battle is not conquest. Like, we're just going to wipe out these people we just don't like because they're not us. It's judgment. These are people who have made themselves enemies of God's people and have deliberately seduced them away from God. And so that's where the judgment is coming from. So the question is, why kill the women? Well, the women in this situation are not innocent bystanders. They were trying to turn the Israelites away from God. They were part of the plot. They were complicit in this. They were trying to drag them into sin so that they could curse them and stop them from what God had for them. But why kill the boys, right? Like, I'm not talking about the soldiers, right? If they were fighting in the battle, that's part of what goes into a battle. But the boys, what happens? We got to remember, in that society, what happens when a father is killed and the young man grows up? Well, that young man becomes an avenger, and I don't mean Tony Stark or Captain America. I mean, they become someone who says, I'm going to get back at the man who killed my father. They become Inigo Montoya, right? Or even Harry Potter, right? Or Paul Atreides, if you saw the Dune movie. Like, if you kill the dad and you don't get the son, that son, even if they are 10 years old now, one day they're going to be 18 years old and they're going to come looking for you. And so it's ugly truth, but in the course of this battle, they needed to take care of all of the threats. But here's the really icky part. Why keep the virgins? It seems like it's like, well, at least you get this good thing. It's like you take a little gold, you take a pretty girl and whatever. Okay, this seems really weird, okay? But you got to think about this. These are young women who are not involved in the sin. Okay, so they weren't going and trying and sleeping with Israelite men to seduce them away from their God. They were not involved in the plot. They're probably still young, right? These are girls that are not yet marriageable age, and so they're there and they're innocent in this situation. They are not a threat in this situation, in large part because they could be a part of Israelite community and be incorporated into Israelite culture. The reality is, if young men come into the culture, they're going to start their own families. They're going to be heads of households. And so they are going to be far more likely to not integrate with Israelite culture. But these young women are going to, if they grow up and get married into Israelite households, they're going to integrate and more likely become part of the culture. And in some ways, I know this seems super weird, it's a little bit of an act of mercy. Now that the moms and dads of these people are killed and the older brothers of these girls are killed, the act of mercy to say, we're going to take you and incorporate you into our society is more merciful than killing them. So this is not like here's the spoils of wars, guys, figure out who you want. This is saying, spare them and incorporate them into your households and eventually marry your sons off to them. This is what's going on here. There are also people who will read this, and I think they've got a case to be made, although I don't fully agree with this, where they would say this is one of those situations that is descriptive rather than prescriptive. You know how we talk about that? Like, sometimes the stories in the Bible are not there because it's supposed to be an example of the way things should be, but just the way things are. Right? That this was Moses' idea, not God's idea, right? Now, then again, God doesn't stop Moses from doing this, and it doesn't seem in the course of the story that this was a bad thing in God's eyes. But it could be that Moses was saying, this is my read, I think this is how we should handle it, and it just is what it is. It isn't something that God commanded, right? It's certainly not prescriptive for us in our era. We are not a nation. We do not go to war as a church. This is not the way it should always be. But in this situation, it seems like this was a judgment call that was made. Now, I will back up and say this. The violence of the Bible, it's okay if it disturbs you. Violence should disturb you. Even divinely permitted or commanded violence is not the ideal. Right? Like, even if there are situations where in the course of the situation in the Bible, God says the way this is going to be handled is through some sort of violent means. David fights Goliath or something like that. That's not something that ever should have had to happen, though, right? Like, you can say this may be a permitted or commanded thing, but it is not something that I am okay with being in the world, because the world was never supposed to require violence. It's not the way the world is supposed to be. So if you read this and you say, ugh, this just makes me sick to my stomach, it breaks my heart, I don't like this, I would encourage you not to look at this and say, I think God is horrible for this, but instead, weep that God's world has become like this, where violent things happen, either wrongfully violent things or required violent things, but either way, things that should never had to have been.
Thanks for listening. If you've got your own questions, email questions@BibleSavvy.com. Like and subscribe to catch our regular episodes every Monday on the Bible Savvy Podcast.